In this video, I will be attempting to survive 100 days in Sri Lanka in hardcore Minecraft. This means I'll have to survive the intense heat, aggressive wildlife, and mythical folklore, all while I explore the amazing wonders that this island has to offer and build myself a base for survival. With that being said, let's get started. I spawned in a grassy field, and soon saw that I wasn't alone. Some big animals over there. Well, I know I'm gonna need food, so I'm gonna go ahead and get ready to eat. Oh, okay, you fight back. You fight back. Alright. After having secured my food, I then went over towards these large animals and saw that they were elephants. Anyways, I decided to head into the water and look around the area. Only those plans soon changed. Okay, yep, crocodiles, alright. Even though Sri Lanka only has 2 types of crocodiles, it appeared that I had found one of them. So I quickly headed back to land and started to gather wood. From here, I crafted a pickaxe and got to mining. I used the stone that I had collected to craft more tools, and after securing more food, I then crafted a boat and headed out to the lake. As I rode around the lake, a large animal eventually caught my eye, so I rode towards it to get a better look. Okay, no, that is a cobra. That is a cobra. Alright, I'm trying to look at this one. Deciding to keep my distance from the cobra, I then towered up nearby and saw this boar. And since I would need food, I went to approach it. Ooh, he's not friendly. Oh, no, he's so fast. He is so fast. That was genuinely the most scared I've gotten in one of these in quite some time. After that fun encounter, I continued to row around the lake and see what was nearby. However, the sky soon began to change colors, as the sun was setting on my very first day in Sri Lanka. And because I didn't have a bed yet, I was left with no other option but to burrow underground. As I begin to mine, I'll turn up the brightness so that it's easier for you to see. And that way you can also see me get confused by the sudden arrival of music. I followed the strange tune for as long as I could, but it eventually faded. So I simply continued mining. And that same night, I found 1 iron ore, right next to these diamonds, which I didn't even know that was a thing, that they could spawn next to each other. And yeah, there seemed to be a lot of diamonds here, but it's not like I could mine them yet anyways. Regardless, the ground above me was soon illuminated by the sun. And when I went to emerge from my burrow, I found a lot of iron. So I quickly mined it, smelted it, and then went to mine the diamonds that I had found. Only I was not expecting there to be 10 diamonds. This might just be one of the best starts I've had in this series. But despite my mining luck, I still had to craft water bottles and a bed. And I didn't see any sand around for the bottles. But at least the bed issue was about to be solved, as I soon saw a wooden structure in the tree line. As I approached it, I saw that it was a watchtower. This meant that there had to be a bed inside. And indeed there was. One of these days, there's going to be no bed in the structure, and I will be quite disappointed. But today is not that day, as I took whatever food this tower had, and then continued on my way. Only that's when I came across this guy. Well, hello. I think you are going to be my friend. I quickly crafted a knife, and then used that knife to gather straw. From there, I crafted a lead, and I now had a friend. So the 2 of us continued north, as my next objective was to find a spot for my base, and that evening, I was finally able to sleep in a bed. Next morning, I woke up and almost stepped onto this pit viper, before then continuing north with Viran. I wanted to find some mountains, as I was planning on making a mountain monastery for my base, Only my thirst was now rapidly depleting, as I still needed sand in order to craft a water bottle. So I just kept walking, as what else could I realistically do? However, soon enough, I did find a mountain. Only, not a normal one.
What?
Viran and I headed towards the massive rock. And after finding these stairs, we climbed up them. And were soon introduced to one of Sri Lanka's ancient wonders. Jutting out of the surrounding jungle here in central Sri Lanka lies Sigiriya. This World Heritage Site houses the ruins of a once grand palace belonging to the King Kashapa. Rising at around 600 feet, or 180 meters above the forested lands around it, Sigiriya is also known as the Lion's Rock, as intricate sculptures of a lion's mouth and body once served as an entrance to this almost 2,000-year-old site, whereas now only the paws remain, greeting visitors as they prepare for the long journey up the rock, via stairs. I saw these very stairs and knew that there was no way I was going to endure this with a peafowl. So I attached Viran to this post, and then started my climb. Yeah, I was getting pretty high up now, but I pushed on. I finally did reach the ruins, where I spent the afternoon looking around them. I then decided to stay here for the night. And the next morning, I woke up and headed back down the stairs. I was then reunited with Viran, only I now had a serious problem. I was getting dangerously dehydrated. If my thirst bar runs out, I am dead. So we had no other option but to look around the surrounding area for sand. Yet no sand was found today. In fact, I didn't even find water until later into day 5. But again, no sand. So I placed my boat in the water and we rowed out to see if perhaps there was sand on the bottom of the lake. However, I didn't even need to check, as shortly after, I found exactly what I was looking for. There was some wildlife around the sand, but I was able to just pull around and dig away from the crocodiles and boar. From here, I smelted the sand and used the glass to craft bottles. I then finally drank some water and healed up. From here, Viran and I continued out across the lake. Only as soon as I saw mountains, I knew that this would be the perfect spot for my base. So we both headed for the mountains right as the sun set. And on day 6, I got right to work on clearing out this area. So while I start my base, let's discuss my objective for this video. See, while Sri Lanka may have fascinating mythology and an abundance of wildlife, both of which we'll be experiencing, in this episode I want to focus on the many incredible wonders and landmarks within this island. So my objective is to craft a camera and photograph 9 of Sri Lanka's most significant wonders. Yes, this is a wonder hunt episode, and the very first wonder that I'll be hunting is Jetavinaramaya. Now as for the rest of day 6, I just started building up the main tower of my base, and I had to be very careful while descending it that evening. Next day I just did a lot of tree chopping. Yeah, this took up most of my time as I had to completely remove the top of this birch tree, which was a bit of a pain. But the next morning, I got to work on making this corridor, before then deciding to mine for the items that I would need to craft a camera. And for those of you who saw my Saskatchewan video, you'll know that the camera crafting recipe isn't too bad, but it does require iron, redstone, and glass, the first of which I would find almost immediately. I decided that day 9 would be the last day of base work for now, so I used this day to outline another building, and then do some more mining. I genuinely can't believe how much iron I found this episode. I even found some redstone later that evening, which meant that I just needed the glass. So after resurfacing, I used the rest of the day to prepare for my journey. I crafted diamond chestplate and some iron armor, as well as the shield. And the next morning, I set off for these sandy banks, as I still needed to collect some more sand before heading to Jetavinarameya. Only now, I was completely out of food, and almost out of hunger. I approached the lake and rowed out towards the island. And soon enough, I saw the boar. I knew that I needed the food desperately, but was it worth risking my life? Well, I'd die without food anyways, so yeah, I approached the boar. However, that's when I saw some herons nearby, and I knew that they would be much easier to kill. So that's just what I did. After eating some bird meat, I was now able to properly start my journey. Now Jetavinarameya is northwest of Sigiriya, meaning that I probably wasn't too far from it. So I rode in that direction, where my travels would continue for the next 2 days. During these 2 days, I ended up crafting the camera and stripping some bark off of these logs. That way I could craft paper for my photos. But of course, all of my actions were overshadowed by the majesty of Sri Lanka's scenery. However, my travels came to a sharp halt on day 13, as I was once again almost starving. That's why I searched around this lake for any wildlife that I could eat. And unfortunately for me, I only saw this water monitor. Yeah, I knew that I needed the food, so I equipped my shield and started attacking. The monitor briefly gave me a poison effect, before I then killed it. I cooked its meat and then killed another one, and from there, I continued northeast, knowing that I had to be nearing the stupa. Only that same evening, I saw some stone ruins in the distance. But you won't get to see me explore them, because for the first time ever on this channel, my recording for day 14 got corrupted. You're not really missing anything though, as I just mined a lot of the stone bricks from my base. And then I found a waterway where I gathered and cooked some kelp. And on day 15, I collected my dried kelp and continued north up this river. I rode for the entire day, and was beginning to worry that I was too far east. However, my worries soon vanished, as a massive stupa appeared in the distance that very evening. Sitting at around 400 feet, or 122 meters tall, this stupa was once the tallest stupa in the world. And for those of you who aren't familiar with stupas, these are dome-shaped Buddhist monuments that can house relics or be used for meditation. Jetavinarameya is a particularly important stupa, as the kingdom of Anuradhapura constructed this incredible building almost 2,000 years ago, which meant that, at the time, it was the third tallest structure in the world, only being beat by 2 of the pyramids in Egypt. This stunning testament to Buddhism is only one of the many impressive structures we'll come across this episode, as Sri Lanka is home to a plethora of stunning landmarks and wonders, all stemming from its ancient history. That evening, I waited for the sun to set and took this photo of it, before then taking a look around the stupa the next morning. Yeah, this thing was huge, and I was able to get another picture of it, but I definitely like the sunset one more. With that being said, I have found the first of 9 wonders, so that meant it was time for me to head home. I decided to take a different route this time, and I rode my way down this river for the rest of the day. As I made my way south on day 17, I came across this heron, and knew that I needed more food. Only that's when I was suddenly attacked, and I soon saw the culprit. Yeah, I had leeches on me, multiple leeches. I knew this was going to be an issue, but I didn't know how hard they would be to hit. Eventually, I was able to kill all of them. Only just a moment later, I would come across another danger. See, I spotted this cave, but as I approached it, something spawned right in front of it. I instantly recognized the Steve-like face, but just to be sure, I towered up and confirmed that I was in the presence of Nagas. Yes, if you haven't seen my Thailand video, then just know that these protective beings are part human and part serpent, and their mythology spans across multiple countries, including Sri Lanka. Yeah, I didn't want to mess with these guys, so I just continued south. And eventually, around midday on day 18, I found a large lake. I can only hope that this is the one my base was near. So I set out across the water, and soon saw some familiar mountains. Now I just had to find my base. I climbed up into the trees and past some monkeys as I tried to figure out where it was. Soon enough, I spotted my tall tower and headed right for it. I was then reunited with Veron that evening, but it wasn't long before I got right to work on mining this diorite. And the next morning, I started filling the tower with it. See, while I don't love diorite as a building block, it is the only white block nearby. So yeah, I kinda have to make do with what I have. After placing the diorite, I then got to work in this farm. Only that's when I got a visitor. As a gesture of kindness, I relieved him of his weeds, and then made him a little house. I then got to mining, as I would need more diorite. And luckily for me, the next day I found a huge reserve of diorite deep within this cliffside. I couldn't even mine all of it, so I collected what I could and applied it to the tower. I ended up finishing 2 walls, before then realizing that I was almost starving the next day. I just continued to add to my walls, but as I did, I also checked on the farm constantly. When the wheat was finally ready, I collected it and crafted some bread. And on day 22, I decided to do some terraforming. I started by terraforming the wandering trader into a cliff. I then got to work on making the cliff stretch around the side of my farm. So while I do that, I might as well reveal what the next wonder on my list is, and that is the Belilena Cave. On day 23, I made an enclosure for Veron and finished my terraforming. I then spent the rest of the day mining diorite, knowing that tomorrow I would be starting my next journey. I woke up on day 24 and started my travels south, as Belilena Cave is right over here, closer to the wetlands of Sri Lanka. However, I decided that before I fully start this journey, I would be taking yet another trip over to Sandy Island, where I'll be hunting the boar. So I rode my way over there, and soon spotted my target. I figured that luring it into the water would be the easiest way to kill it, so I did just that. And yeah, it was actually pretty easy. Plus, I got this cool advancement and a boar head. Regardless, I then cooked the meat and continued south. On day 25, I found myself in a more mountainous part of Sri Lanka, but familiarity returned to me in the form of leeches. Only this time, there were a lot of them. Yeah, they actually managed to do some damage. So I really had no choice but to run. Later that same evening, I found myself in the presence of something strange. Yeah, strange cries sounded out around me, and darkness filled my vision. This happened to me multiple times, so I just decided to keep moving and leave the area. Who knows, perhaps it's haunted. As I made my way further south, I began to climb higher into Sri Lanka's mountainous terrain. This was a clear indicator that I had to be nearing the cave. However, it wasn't until day 27 that I would find what I was looking for. See, I had taken the treetop climbing approach, and this made it easy for me to spot a waterfall in the distance. Upon approaching it, I saw a deep cave hidden behind the falls. When it comes to prehistoric wonders on this channel, none so far have been quite as significant as the Belilena Cave. Upon excavation in the 1970s and 80s, skeletal remains were found, some of which dated back over 16,000 years. However, even more impressively, some of the living sites themselves date back over 30,000 years. I cannot stress how astonishing that is, especially when you consider that the remains found belonged to the Balangoda man, which were prehistoric Homo sapiens unique to the island of Sri Lanka. Today, further excavations are planned, both in the main cave and the surrounding shelters, and who knows what mysteries of prehistoric humanity will be unveiled. As I collected wood to craft paper, a storm started up, so I crafted the paper and snapped a photo, before then heading into the cave. I then cleared the cave of mobs, and took a look around. Soon after, the sun began to set. It's strange thinking that this is what it must have been like thousands of years ago for any of the prehistoric humans living in this very cave. It's very quiet. On the morning of day 28, I knew it was time to head home. Before leaving the cave, I took a look at the photos I had taken, and I decided that I liked the cave interior one more. Anyways, with 2 out of 9 wonders now explored, I headed back to my base, but this time in a new direction. I headed more east-northeast, as I wanted to see some new landscapes on the way home. Only that afternoon, I passed what could only have been a Naga cave. But I didn't want to explore it, as I needed food. So, that evening, as I found this river, I collected some kelp and began to cook it. Next morning, I ate the kelp and started to row up the river. Only I had no idea what I was about to run into. As I made my way north up this waterway, something huge suddenly passed beneath my boat. So, I pulled over and very cautiously entered the water. And then, I saw it. Yeah, this thing was huge. And it started swimming right towards me. However, as I carefully approached it, it didn't seem like it wanted to hurt me. I was considering that maybe this creature was friendly. But can I ride you? That is, until this happened. Okay, I cannot ride you. I cannot ride you. Yeah, I immediately swam up and got in my boat. And naturally, I rode for the rest of the day. Over the next few days, I slowly made my way home. The mountains proved to be much more difficult to cross on the way back. Oh, and I also came across more leeches. And another Naga cave. But by the afternoon of day 33, I had reached my lake, which meant that on day 34, I made it home. and I certainly have some base building to do. Yeah, I got right to work on mining in my diorite reserve, before then applying that diorite to the base. And the next day, I made a new floor. I also worked on this spiral staircase, and finished this wall. On day 36, I focused entirely on the second floor, and I connected it to this corridor, which I dug out. I also made these windows and added some accents. So while I work on the second floor, let me reveal the next location, which is Wilpatu National Park. And here you see a sloth bear, because that's exactly what I'll be trying to find and photograph there. But with that being said, day 37 was my last day of base work for now. I mostly worked on making a third floor, and did some interior design, before then finishing out the day by extending the staircase some more. Today's the day. It's officially time to head to the third wonder of this video. Only this time, I'll be bringing a guest. Yes, I decided that I might as well bring Varan on this one, as Wilpatu is more or less directly northwest from here. I know this because it's just west of Jedavanaramaya. But before we get going, I wanted to stop by Sandy Island again. This time because I needed glass for my windows. So we head over to the island and I docked my boat. I then collected some sand and kept an eye on these crocodiles. Yeah, this time I have to protect both myself and Varan. Anyways, we then headed west, and reached this dry open field by that evening. Varan and I continued through these grasslands for a good portion of the next day. That is, until I spotted another cave. This time, I decided that I wanted to try and loot it. So I slowly approached the cave. Only I was soon met with a Naga wielding a spear. Yeah, he managed to get me pretty low, so I decided to change up my strategy. Yes, if you'll remember, this is the same strategy that I used back in Thailand. And this strategy soon yielded success. Only I was then hit through the wall by the other Naga. Yeah, now I was really low, but at least I was able to look inside this chest. I quickly gathered some food, some snake skin, a nice fishing rod, and some strange relics, one of which gave me a lightning strike attack, and the other made it so that I can briefly sprint on water. So yeah, I was pretty happy with my findings. Happy enough to return to Varan, and just keep going on our journey. You know, there is an interesting story in Buddhism that adds some depth to the Nagas. See, it's rumored that one day, during the Buddha's meditation, a powerful storm began. The Naga king Muchalinda saw that the Buddha was deep in meditation, and so, to shelter him from the storm, he coiled around him and used his scaly hood to protect him from the rain. As Varan and I headed further west, our travels were accelerated by the tea that I had found in the chest. However, not much happened today, as I simply encountered some more leeches, and then saw this cobra that evening. On day 41, we just continued through this grassy field. And even though I saw trees in the distance, I still had to stop and do some fishing, because yeah, I really needed food. But later that day, as we entered the forest, we came across some elephants. However, it would be an incredibly rare sighting that evening that would tell me just where I was, because I had somehow come across the elusive Sri Lankan leopard, meaning that I had to already be in Wilpatu. Wilpatu. Not only is it the largest national park in Sri Lanka, but it is one of the oldest, being officially established as a national park in 1938. Since then, it has grown to be a stunning safari reserve, where you can find animals like the previously mentioned Sri Lankan leopard, as well as the sloth bear. Now, the actual name, Wilpatu, roughly translates to the land of the lakes, referencing the many natural lakes spread throughout this giant reserve. So in short, Wilpatu is not only a great place to spot some of Sri Lanka's most famous wildlife, but it also offers a naturally scenic glimpse into the pearl of the Indian Ocean. I found one of the small lakes the next day, and decided to take this opportunity to do some fishing. After I'd caught enough fish, I then went to strip some more bark off of some of the logs, in order to craft paper. From there, Veron and I searched around the area for the sloth bear. But that afternoon, we found another large animal. Yes, it was another wild boar. Seeing that my axe was about to break, I quickly went to craft a new one. Only that's when it charged. So the next morning, now having finally crafted a stone axe, I approached the boar. But this time, we weren't fighting in the water, and that meant that it could actually do some damage. Yeah, I got hit pretty hard here, but my lightning relic hit the boar right back. Only that soon backfired, as it ended up setting me on fire as well. Yeah, now I was really low. So I quickly healed up just in time to deal the final blow. At least now I had some more food, so I cooked the meat in my furnace, and then we continued our search. As the day progressed, we only ended up finding some water buffalo. But that very same evening, I heard a new noise. I quickly attached Veron to a post, and then went to investigate it. And sure enough, it was the sloth bear. I kept my distance from it and got my camera out, but I just couldn't get a clear photo. Next morning, I was finally able to get some decent pictures. But then some more sloth bears arrived, so yeah, I decided that it'd be best to leave. I headed back to Veron, and the two of us started our long journey home. Over the next few days, Veron and I traveled through the grasslands and forestry, and I was reminded of how much I dislike leading mobs. But while we make our way home, let's discuss the animal that I just encountered. Sloth bears are found throughout the Indian subcontinent, and are known for their messy hair, looking as though they've just gotten out of bed. When they were initially discovered, they were thought to be related to sloths, thus giving them the name sloth bear. This assumption was further fueled by the fact that these bears spend time hanging around up in trees. However, make no mistake, as while the sloth bear may appear smaller and less threatening, they can actually be very aggressive. So while I may have approached them in Minecraft, it is certainly not advised to approach a wild sloth bear in real life, as they can quite easily show their scarier side. After making it home on day 49, I knew that I had some more base work to do. But I wanted to start this work session by dealing with the mobs that were hiding in my walls. I then placed glass in my windows, and got to work on clearing an area for another tower. The next day I outlined the tower area, before then visiting the reserve again. But while I do some mining, I want to give a quick thanks to two of my Sri Lankan viewers who helped me research this video. Both Amura and his friend Omith gave me a lot of insight into this spectacular country and helped me represent Sri Lanka more authentically. So a huge thanks to the both of them. Anyways, the next day I started on the roof, only that's when I realized that I would need a lot more deep slate for this. So I just went down and put blinds and accents on all the windows. And on day 52, I finished the window trims, before then doing some reserve mining. So while I mine from my seemingly infinite diorite reserve, let me reveal what the next two locations are, as I'll be visiting two at once this time. And they are Candy and Lipton's Seat. I took one extra day for base work, and decided to use it on this tower. Oh, I also started transforming the first floor into my kitchen. But with that being said, it was now time for another journey. Before fully setting off, you know the routine by now. Yes, I had to stop by Sandy Island again. Yeah, I needed more windows. So I head over there and collected some more sand. Now I could finally set off for Candy, which is more or less directly south from here, although I do have to go up and over some mountains. I reached those mountains by the afternoon, only I didn't realize that something would soon hinder my trip. Yes, a cyclone had moved in, and a strong one at that. So I decided to be cautious and make my way up the mountains via treetop. However, when I eventually had to move to the ground, I was met with a cobra. It headed right for me, so I quickly equipped my shield and defended myself. I then left and just kept running until I was out of food. Yeah, this wasn't good, but luckily for me, I saw water ahead, which meant that there had to be kelp. So I began collecting kelp in the stormy waters, and of course, that's when I saw a shape. Yeah, it was the creature from earlier. I collected what I could, but when it started to approach me, I had no choice but to head for the shore. I placed down my furnaces and began to cook the kelp. Only now, I had leeches on me. Yeah, I cannot catch a break today. So I headed back into the water and killed them, before eating what little kelp I could. As the storm passed, I went to get another look at this creature. I headed back into the water, and soon enough, it emerged from the depths. This thing just looked wild. And I definitely didn't want to get too close to it again. So I just decided to get back in my boat and keep rowing, knowing that this creature of folklore is not to be messed with. Sri Lanka is a place of many cultures and many religions, and while Buddhism may be the dominant religion here, Hinduism follows in second place, and yields a legendary creature known as the Makara. This defensive creature is often depicted as a mixture of many animals, such as a crocodile, elephant, fish, peacock, and many others. And while the Makara may come from Hinduism, it transcends many cultures, as here in Sri Lanka, the Makara can be found engraved near the entrances to many Buddhist temples. However, while this creature is known as a guardian of water, it is not inherently evil, like some of the other myths that I've found in this channel. Therefore, I will not be attempting to vanquish it, but that doesn't mean that I won't have to be extremely careful around it. Since I had more or less successfully crossed the mountains, I now headed west across this river, as Candy had to be in that direction. At least, I was really hoping that it was. So when the river turned north the next day, I knew that it was probably best to leave it and walk west from here. I entered this forested area and kept expecting to come across the city, but yeah, I didn't see anything. At least I didn't come across any dangerous wildlife though. Well, until that evening, where I got attacked by even more leeches as I tried to do some fishing. Anyways, the very next morning, I continued west through the forest, and almost immediately spotted a building. Yes, my navigation has yet to fail me, because this was definitely Candy. Here in central Sri Lanka lies both a sacred city and a World Heritage Site, and that is Kandy. This incredible city dates back to the 15th century and was able to resist colonial powers until 1815, when the Kandyan Convention was signed, allowing for the British to successfully acquire Sri Lanka. And while Sri Lanka gained independence in 1948, this is why you can find colonial architecture throughout the city, mixed with the more traditional architecture from the Kingdom of Kandy. But above all, here in Kandy, you can find the Sri Dalda Madagawa, or the Temple of the Sacred Tooth. This temple houses a relic unlike any other, a tooth from the Buddha himself, making the city of Kandy one of the most significant Buddhist cities in the world. And needless to say, I'll have plenty to explore here. But I decided to start in this shop, where I saw some pretty cool items. I only took this hay bale and some gold. And look, I've been surviving in the Sri Lankan wilderness for over 50 days, so I'll be paying for these with moss blocks. Anyways, in another building, I decided to take some lanterns for my base. Oh, and I found some really useful stuff here too, like these arrows and this bow, as well as this Prot 1 book. Only after heading back out into the city, I then found an office building. And yes, there were villagers at work in here. I didn't want to disturb them, so I just kept looking around. And that's when I found this elevator. Yeah, I've got to give huge props to the channel's new builder, T, and you can find her and all of my team members in the description. Anyways, I went to enter this other building, where I found an anvil. I went ahead and used it to put Prot in my chest plate, and I noticed that the sun was beginning to set. So, I headed into this restaurant, and went upstairs. Up here, I found a nice temporary room. Next morning, I woke up and knew that I had to take a look at the temple. I headed back out into the city and began my search for it. But I first found this vehicle on the side of the street. Anyways, as I saw Candy Lake, I knew that I was heading in the right direction. And sure enough, the temple soon appeared in the distance. I approached it, but before entering the temple, I decided to put all of my items in a chest, save for my camera and paper. That's because many temples in Sri Lanka require you to remove certain things like shoes, hats, leather, and obviously in my case, weapons. So I went ahead and removed everything just to cover all bases. And yeah, it certainly felt weird walking around in hardcore with no armor on and with no weapons. But I proceeded anyways. I explored all the rooms I could find, but there were certain buildings that I couldn't enter, as you aren't actually allowed to see the tooth relic in real life. I did, however, run into this strange-looking golem. This guy started to approach me, so I just backed away and decided to leave. On the way out, I got a picture of the temple. I then collected all of my items and went to find a place to stay for the night, as tomorrow I'll be heading south to Lipton's Seat. I made my way through the city and ended up finding the Queen's Hotel, which is a rather historically famous hotel. I then entered and made my way to a room, which ended up being the fanciest hotel room that I've ever seen in this series. So we have the bathroom, very nice, very nice, very nice shower. And then we have the bookshelves, lots of nice books here. Wow, good books, love books. And then we have the bed, very big bed. As I looked out on the balcony, I took one last look at Candy, knowing that I'll be leaving it tomorrow. Next morning, I woke up and took a quick look around the hotel, before then leaving it and heading for the train station. Yes, that's right, I'll be taking a train to Lipton's Seat, just like in my Himalayas video. To find the station, I had to search the city a little bit more, but I eventually spotted a train in the distance, and knew that this had to be my station. Oh, and I may have forgotten to mention that the train ride from Candy, passing Lipton's Seat, is said to be one of the most scenic train rides in the world. But why tell you about it, when I could just show you? After a long but incredible train ride, I'd finally arrived at a rather rural station. And this is where I want to thank the MTR mod for allowing such a journey to happen. Anyways, now that I was here, I actually had no idea where Lipton's seat was. So, I decided to tower up with these moss blocks, and I turned my render distance way up. This allowed me to see a slope in the distance, which I could only assume led to the peak. And by that evening, I was now about 80% sure that this was the peak, as it seemed to be pretty tall. I continued climbing up the mountainside the next morning, and sure enough, I soon saw a massive field of what could only be tea. If you're like me and you enjoy a cup of tea during the day, then you might be familiar with the brand Lipton. And if you are, then you might be surprised to hear that here in Sri Lanka, you can find endless fields of tea, all in the name of Sir Thomas Lipton. And of course, this is home to Lipton's seat, an observation point almost 2,000 meters, or 6,500 feet in the air. This viewpoint is consistently listed as hosting one of the most stunning views in the world, overlooking the vast fields of tea and the mountains of southern Sri Lanka. As I approached the tea plantation, I saw some gardeners walking the paths. Unfortunately, I didn't have any emeralds. Otherwise, I might have bought some flowers. But instead, I did eat some tea, because why not, I guess. But to keep exploring, I also did have to walk across some tea. So Lipton, if you suddenly find some trampled crops, it was, Varan, not me. As I headed further up this mountain, I eventually spotted the famous Lipton seat sign. Only from here, I saw a path that headed up even further. So I walked my way up it, and eventually found myself at the viewpoint. I walked out a bit and took a nice photo, before then realizing that I really had to get it moving, as I still have 4 wonders to get to. Yeah, this was a bit of a stressful realization, as I simply cannot fill my objective here. After taking some tea to go, I headed west, as I remembered seeing the train pass over a river that went north. I reached the forest that same night, and the next day I pushed on. Only around midday, I came across another cobra. I didn't have much time for this, but I equipped my shield anyways. Only that's when I heard the strange noise again. This was terrible timing, as I was soon blinded while the cobra attacked me. But it was my lightning relic that almost killed me. Yeah, it lit us both on fire and allowed for the cobra to get a strike in. So I quickly placed water and cooled off with only 2 hearts now left. Yeah, with no other option, I ran. As I did, I kept getting blinded by whatever was making the noise. Eventually, it stopped, and I was able to reach a river by that afternoon. Over the next few days, I headed north and tried to get home as fast as possible. Only almost 2 entire days were used up by rowing. Luckily for me though, I didn't encounter many dangerous animals, which meant that I was able to reach my base on the afternoon of day 67. All I did today was place this framed image. The next day, I got to work on my base. But this time, I'm only allowing myself 3 days to work, as I'm really going against the clock here. I used all my time today to work on the kitchen. I added some countertops, another picture, and some general decorations. Then on day 69, I worked on the next floor, which will be the dining room. I added some tables and chairs, before then making more blinds, and adding this light fixture. Next morning, I started on my very own room. I made my bed accessible by this staircase, which I then added a closet to underneath. I also placed the boar head up on this shelf, and visited my reserve that evening. So while I mine some more diorite, let me reveal the next wonder that I'll be visiting, and that is the Makara National Park, where I'll be photographing a Sri Lankan elephant. it was once again time for me to set off for another wonder. And this one should be relatively easy, as it's just northeast of Sigiriya. So I headed north towards Sigiriya first. And yeah, for the first time, I did not need to head to Sandy Island. As I went further north into what I recognized as my spawn area, a storm started up. I rode around the lake and saw 2 boars that I had seen on day 1. Only this storm soon became quite violent, so I wanted to find the watchtower again. Only I wasn't able to find it until the next morning. The violent storm made it really difficult to see in the forest, but eventually I found it and started heading up the stairs. From here, I collected some of the oak wood, as I only had birch and spruce at my base. However, I soon noticed something very alarming. I was being pulled towards the window. Yeah, it was a cyclone, and this was not good. I immediately went to run down the stairs, but was consistently pulled towards the lake. Upon finally reaching the trees again, I ran for my life. The storm had blown over by the next morning, and I was lucky enough to have evaded it, but I didn't have time to linger. I headed for Sigiriya up a somewhat familiar path. I found the giant rock that afternoon, and I quickly said hi, before then reaching this grassy field by the evening. As I made my way north through the grass, I spotted a large body of water ahead, so I entered it and began to row north. I noticed that the scenery was also different. But it wasn't until I spotted a lot of elephants that I knew I had reached Minaria. As one of Sri Lanka's most famous safari sites, Minaria National Park is home to an incredible array of biodiversity and stunning scenery that represents some of the best of the island. For instance, take the Minaria Tank, a giant reservoir that was actually man-made by the Anuradhapura Kingdom and was achieved by building a dam on the river nearby. But the park itself is even more famous for a natural phenomenon known as the gathering. Here, every dry season, around 300 elephants gather in herds around the tank, making Minaria home to one of the largest elephant gatherings in the world. And while we're on the topic, let's quickly discuss the Sri Lankan elephant. These guys are the face of Sri Lanka, and the largest of the Asian elephants. However, here they are not only celebrated, but also heavily protected. See, unfortunately, they are classified as endangered, and are actually more at risk than the African elephant. But legislation is in place to protect these giant animals, as killing a Sri Lankan elephant can lead to the death penalty. I rode my way around the tank, before then realizing that I needed paper. So I headed into this forested area and did some bark shaving. I then got a less than stellar photo that evening. Next morning, I decided that I wanted to explore Minaria a little bit more before I leave it. So, after dealing with some leeches that morning, I headed up this river and saw some more of the scenery. I also ended up coming across another Makara, and naturally, I decided that I wanted to get a picture of this guy. So, I headed into the water and cautiously snapped a picture, before then turning around and heading south through the park, as I really have to get moving. Speaking of which, the next wonder that I'll be checking off my list is the Dambulla Cave Temple. And yeah, I'll be heading straight for it. But the only downside is that I now have to backtrack past Sigiriya, as it's actually just to the left of the lake that my base is on. Meaning that on day 76, I literally just ran. Yeah, I really wanted to reach the final wonders in time, but I was honestly a little bit concerned that I wouldn't make it. Either way, with the power of determination, I reached Sigiriya by early afternoon. And then I reached the field in front of it shortly after. Next day, I continued south and passed some sloth bears. Soon enough, I reached the spawn lake, and then continued through the forest from there. However, upon reaching the lake that my base is on, I had no choice but to stop and do some fishing, as I was out of food. As I fished, I took a look at Google Earth, just to see where the temple was from here. See, while I may make these maps, the sheer scale of them makes it really difficult for me to know where something is. So, sometimes I have no choice but to use Google Earth, just like I have to in my other videos. But with that being said, I rode out onto the lake, and headed through the forest that evening. Next morning, I decided to use the render distance technique again, but that only succeeded in making my frames drop. Yeah, I didn't see anything. So I continued east, and really hoped that I was getting close. However, when it came time to check again, I didn't even need to turn up my render distance, as I saw a large structure in the distance ahead of me. I headed towards it and soon came across a road with some buildings. Only as I walked up these stone stairs, I was soon met with a really cool sight. The Dambulla Cave Temple. This incredible piece of history has been a site of pilgrimage for 22 centuries. Just think about that for a moment. For 22 centuries, people have been coming to this cave complex. Inside, you'll find 5 different caverns, filled with many statues and murals depicting the Buddha and many other religious scenes. Here in Minecraft, this cavern only gives you a glimpse of the real-life wonder, as there is just nothing like the real cave temple. But residing at the bottom of the cavern's rock is this huge statue of the Buddha, decorating the Golden Temple. And you might have noticed that Dambulla is very much an active monastery, as the monks residing here today carry on the legacy of this ancient site. Before entering, I had a few things to do. First, I put my items in a chest again. Then I went fishing for some more food. And finally that evening, I crafted some more paper. So the next morning, I was now ready to enter the site. I entered the Golden Temple and heard a lot of mobs underneath it. So I just continued along the path up the rock, which in reality consists of over 300 steps. Eventually, I reached the top and headed into the cavern. It was an entirely different atmosphere inside. And there was also this strange animal on the floor. Yeah, I really have no idea what that is. But I made my way around the cavern and looked at the various statues within. On the way out, I got a decent picture, before then preparing myself for the penultimate wonder, and that is the Sinharaja Forest Reserve, where I'll be attempting to photograph the Sri Lankan leopard. But there is one problem with this. The reserve is all the way down here in southern Sri Lanka. Yeah, this was not good, as it meant that I would almost certainly miss the final wonder. However, that same afternoon, as I walked back down the stone stairs, I saw a vehicle, just like the one that I had seen in Candy. My new vehicle faced an obstacle the next morning, and that was the forest. But I was able to weave my way through the trees, and by midday, I had reached an open field. Yeah, I went as fast as I could, because just maybe, I'll be able to reach the final 2 wonders. I sped my way through the open fields of grass, but as I drove that evening, a storm came through. Of course, that didn't matter. I drove through most of day 81, as fast as I reasonably could. Only I kept hitting the vehicle against trees, and I was really worried that I would break it. But this thing held itself together, even as I spotted a tall mountain that evening. I knew that by now I had to at least be nearing Sinharaja, so I decided to climb the mountain and use it as a vantage point. However, as I did, the vehicle just kept getting stuck. Yeah, unfortunately, this is where we had to part ways. Goodbye, strange car thingy. You will be missed. From here, I continued climbing on foot. And I reached the top of the mountain the next morning. I turned my render distance up, but I didn't see anything. So I decided to continue southeast and keep using this strategy. And finally, it actually paid off. Only it wasn't Sinharaja that I had found. No, I saw a structure. Yeah, I was a bit confused, but I approached it anyways. I soon found what looked to be two separate buildings connected by a pathway. So I headed over towards this one first. Over here, I found some loot that looked to be mostly mining stuff. But yeah, there wasn't really anything else over here. So I headed for the other building. And over here, I found a ladder that went down really far into the ground. Yeah, it was pretty clear that this was the entrance to a mine shaft. So I cautiously lowered myself down to take a look. The mine was pretty eerie, but what made it worse were these noises that I suddenly began to hear. And then I saw a floating pickaxe. Yeah, I decided to play it safe and leave. Only when I resurfaced, I saw this gem. This made me realize that I was probably in the Sabaragamuwa province of Sri Lanka, most known for its mining, as Sri Lanka is quite famous for its gemstone mining industry. But even more importantly for me, the Sabaragamuwa province is home to the Sinharaja Forest Reserve. I did some fishing to finish out the day. And the next morning, I continued southeast, now hopeful that I was approaching the reserve. However, time was running out, so I continued to run through the grassy environment in search of a change in scenery. After all, the Sinharaja Forest Reserve will definitely look different from the landscape that I've been traveling in. Therefore, that same afternoon, as I saw bamboo and large rocks forming around me, I became a bit more optimistic. Yeah, I was really hoping that this was Sinharaja. So, to see if it was, I began climbing up the side of this mountain as the sun set. It wasn't until about midday that I was able to come over the top of the mountain and see the scenery on the other side. And sure enough, this had to be Sinharaja. When you look at this rainforest, a few things may come to mind, such as wildlife, forestry, or undisturbed nature. But the Sinharaja Forest Reserve is much more than another one of Asia's many tropics, as Sinharaja is Sri Lanka's last remaining untouched tropical rainforest. Protections began in 1977, when Sinharaja was declared as a royal reserve, and a few years later, it became a World Heritage Site. More than 60% of the trees here are endemic to the island, and it is home to some incredibly rare wildlife, like the Sri Lankan leopard. Now, there are conflicting sources on the status of this elusive animal, with some listing it as vulnerable, and most listing it as endangered. And I'm inclined to believe the latter, as it's estimated that less than 1,000 of them still remain in the wild. But this doesn't stop the leopard from owning the ecosystems that it resides in, as this cat is the apex predator of the island, making any sighting of them not only a trepidatious experience, but also a very rare one. I headed down to the river and decided to row around in search of the leopard, but in all honesty, I was a little bit worried about finding this one. After all, I'm essentially looking for a needle in a Sinharaja-sized haystack. Later that afternoon, I decided to leave the river and properly search on land. But I only found some peafowls. Next morning, I woke to the sight of a really strange and terrifying creature. Yeah, it was definitely from one of the mods I'm using, so I just turned the other way and continued my search. Eventually, I went back to the river to do some fishing. But upon my return to the rainforest, I didn't find anything. Yeah, at this point, I had a judgment call to make. See, I could either fail the mini objective of finding the leopard, or fail this episode's objective of reaching each wonder. Of course, I decided to surrender the leopard objective. And I believe that that's a channel first, which just shows you that this kind of thing can really happen at any time. Regardless, this meant that I was now onto my final wonder, which is Adam's Peak. And luckily for me, it's just barely north of here. So I set off north out of Sinharaja. Only that afternoon, I heard the cries again. Next morning, I decided that I was going to find the source of this noise. So I towered up and looked around the area. But of course, I didn't see anything. That is, until I pulled out my camera and saw two tiny ears and a head. Knowing that this had to be the source, I made my way over to it and found, well, a bird? Yeah, apparently this whole time, a bird had been making the noise. And honestly, I'm just relieved that it wasn't something trying to kill me. So, with that strange discovery, I headed north and continued my travels through the misty mountains. But as I climb, let me do a quick mini segment explaining these guys. See, the devil bird, or Ulama, is a creepy legend of the Sri Lankan forests, as this owl-like creature has been spotted by many of the locals, and is said to emit a horrific sound, akin to a human scream. But in reality, they're just forest eagle owls, which are rather intimidating looking owls that live across Southeastern Asia. Now as for my travels, well, I made my way north through the entirety of day 87. Not much happened today, but I did come to the sad realization that my base is probably a lost cause at this point. There was so much that I had planned for it, but just like my Himalayas episode, I'm afraid this base may remain unfinished. I reached the mountains on day 88, and from here, I climbed. Later in the day, I found this boar that seemed to be stuck, so I killed it and collected the food, before then climbing higher into the mountains. Only that night, I saw the faint glow of lights in the distance. Next morning, I headed straight for them. Upon reaching the lanterns, I saw that they were attached to a path that curved up the side of this mountain, so naturally, I followed the path. Eventually, I reached these stone stairs, and ahead of me was Adam's Peak. Adam's Peak, also known as Sri Pada, is a large cone-like mountain that towers over the rocky landscape around it, reaching a height of 2,200 meters, or 7,200 feet. However, it's what lies at the top that cements its cultural and religious significance. Here at the summit, you can find an imprint about the size and shape of a human foot. And this is where the religious diversity of Sri Lanka really shines through, as Buddhists believe it to be a footprint from the Buddha upon his third visit to the peak. Christians and Muslims believe it to be from Adam after being cast out of paradise and landing here, while Hindus believe it to be from Shiva. Regardless of its origin, this makes Sri Pada a famous pilgrimage site for people of all four faiths. And in order to properly experience the pilgrimage, adventurous spirits begin to climb up the 5,500 steps of the mountain at night, reaching the summit right at sunrise. I once again put my items in a chest, and then explored the various buildings at the top. However, I noticed that I was actually getting cold for the first time in this episode. I stepped down the stairs a bit and snapped a photo of the peak, before then staying the night here. And the next morning, I saw the famous sunrise. Despite the fact that I have some tough travels home ahead of me, I stayed and watched for a bit, because this is essentially my farewell to this unparalleled island. I then collected my things and headed back down the mountain. Over the next few days, I made my way home, with more rowing than I would ever like to do again. However, as I make my way home, I will go ahead and rate the difficulty of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka gave me some tough challenges, mostly with the wildlife and the weather. However, the terrain was by far one of the toughest challenges in recent memory, landing Sri Lanka with a solid 7 out of 10 in terms of difficulty. But with that being said, I made it home midday on day 97. And yeah, I basically had no time to finish my base, as base review is on day 99. But I'm going to do what I can. So I got right to work on the roof. I went for a facade approach, meaning that I only made the front of it. Even with this, I ran out of deep slate really fast, so I then spent the rest of the day mining as much diorite as possible. Next morning, I added it to the last tower, as I could at least finish this wall. I then went around and placed the rest of my lanterns, before realizing that I couldn't really do anything else. Yeah, especially with an unfinished roof, there's just not much room for improvement. So, I just decided to wait for base review. I woke up on day 99 and took a look around each room, before coming up with a final verdict. Let's start with the interiors. Easily the best part of the base. I say this because the dining room and kitchen are quite nice. And the other interiors, well, yeah, they're unfinished. And on that note, let's discuss the exterior. This is where the base takes the biggest hit, as without a proper roof, it's just not good. But to end on a better note, we'll discuss the terraforming. This is something I want to do a lot more of with my future bases, as I quite liked the terraforming that I did here. Varan's enclosure also looks pretty good. But with all of that taken into account, I give this base a rather sad 4 out of 10. Yes, if I had finished it, I easily think it could have been a 9. But disappointments aside, there's still one more day. I woke up on day 100 and headed out to Varan's enclosure, before then walking down to the lake to do some rowing. As I rode among the mountains and wildlife, I thought about the last 100 days and just what kind of a place Sri Lanka had been. See, Sri Lanka may be an island in the Indian Ocean, but it very much asserts its presence as not only one of the most stunning countries in Asia, but one of the most historically diverse places I've ever covered in this series. Here you can find caves of pilgrimage that have been used for thousands of years, as well as caves holding prehistoric settlements. But if that's not enough, you can find the ruins of an ancient kingdom, or a city holding a sacred relic. Yet somehow the nature shines through all of that, with Sri Lanka's incredible level of biodiversity and endemism. In other words, this truly is the pearl of the Indian Ocean, as there is nowhere on Earth quite like Sri Lanka. Alright. With all of that being said, it is about that time. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next episode.